He hadn't touched another human being in 10 years. But when Clara Belle knocked on his door that morning, everything Silas Ward believed about isolation was about to crumble. The sound echoed through his cabin like thunder. 3 deliberate knocks that seemed to shake the very foundations of the life he'd built in solitude. Silas froze at his kitchen table, coffee cup halfway to his lips, steam rising like ghosts between him and the door. Nobody came here. Nobody even knew this place existed, buried deep in the canyon where the mesa cast shadows that lasted most of the day. His hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down. The coffee was bitter, like everything else in his world had become. Through the small window he could see her silhouette against the morning light, a woman in a simple dress, standing perfectly still as if she had all the time in the world. But something about her posture spoke of urgency, of a desperation she was trying hard to contain. Silas stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard labor and harder nights. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he approached the door, each step feeling like a betrayal of the promise he'd made to himself a decade ago. Never again would he let someone close enough to cause the kind of pain that had driven him to this forsaken place. He stopped just short of the door, his weathered hand hovering over the wooden latch. Through the gap beneath the door, he could see her shadow hadn't moved. She was waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some doors took time to open. "I know you're in there." Her voice came through the wood, soft but clear. "I've been walking for 2 days to find you." 2 days. The nearest town was a day's hard ride, which meant she'd come on foot through country that could kill a man, let alone a woman traveling alone. Silas pressed his palm against the door, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his skin. The same wood he'd cut and shaped with his own hands when he'd built this refuge from the world. "Please," she continued, and there was something in her voice that cut through his defenses like a blade through paper. "I need your help, and I think you might need mine too." The words hung in the air between them, separated only by inches of wood and years of carefully constructed walls. Silas closed his eyes, remembering the last time someone had asked for his help, the last time he'd believed he could save anyone. His hand moved to the latch almost without his permission. The metal was cold against his palm, colder than the morning air, colder than the fear that was beginning to thaw something deep in his chest he'd thought was frozen forever. The door opened like a wound being reopened. Clara Belle stood there in the harsh morning light, and Silas felt something inside him crack at the sight of her face. She was younger than her voice had suggested, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. But it was the bruise along her left cheek, faded to yellow at the edges, that made his jaw tighten. "Silas Ward," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "You're exactly what they said you'd be." "Who's they?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from disuse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken aloud, and the sound of it seemed foreign in his own ears. "People in town talk." She shifted the small leather satchel she carried, and he noticed her hands were steady, despite the exhaustion that lined her face. "They say you used to be someone different, before you came here to disappear." The words hit him like a physical blow. Silas stepped back involuntarily, his instinct to slam the door and retreat to the safety of his solitude. But something kept him rooted in place, maybe the way she stood there without fear, as if she understood exactly what kind of man she was facing. "They also say," Clara continued, taking a small step forward, "that you're the only person in 3 counties who might understand what it's like to lose everything in a single moment." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know anything about what I've lost, don't I?" She reached into her satchel and pulled out a worn photograph, holding it up so he could see. A man in a dark suit stood beside a woman in white, both smiling at something beyond the camera. "This was taken 6 months ago, my wedding day. 3 hours after this picture was taken, my husband was dead." The photograph trembled slightly in her grip, and Silas found himself studying her face instead of the image. There was no self-pity there, no tears threatening to fall. Just a hollow acceptance that made his chest ache in ways he'd forgotten were possible. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate. "But I can't help you. I don't help anyone anymore. You haven't even heard what I'm asking." "Doesn't matter. The answer's the same." Clara tucked the photograph back into her satchel, but she didn't move away from his doorstep. Instead, she looked past him into the cabin, and he saw her taking in the sparse furniture, the single plate and cup, the complete absence of anything that suggested a life shared with another person. "The men who killed my husband," she said quietly. "They're coming for me. They think I have something that belongs to them. And they're right." But it wasn't the admission that made Silas's blood run cold. It was the sound of horses approaching fast, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls like thunder before a storm. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like a death knell. Silas counted them automatically. 3 horses, maybe 4, riding hard and closing fast. His hand moved instinctively to where his gun belt used to hang, finding only empty air and the bitter reminder of choices made long ago. "How many?" he asked, already pulling Clara inside and slamming the door shut behind her. 3 men, maybe more by now. Clara's voice remained steady, but he caught the way her fingers gripped the leather satchel tighter. "They've been tracking me for days." Silas moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains he'd sewn from old flour sacks. 3 riders emerged from the narrow canyon entrance, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. Even at this distance, he could see the hard lines of their faces, the deliberate way they scanned the area like predators who'd found their prey's scent. "What's in the bag?" he asked without turning around. "Evidence. Enough to hang all 3 of them and the men who hired them." "Then why haven't you taken it to the law?" Clara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Because the law is who hired them." The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. He'd run from many things in his life, but corruption wearing a badge was something that followed a man no matter how far he rode. His own hands had been stained by trust placed in the wrong people, by believing that justice and law were the same thing. The riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough that he could see their faces clearly now. The one in front wore a deputy's star that caught the morning sun like a warning. Behind him, 2 men with the look of hired guns sat their horses with the lazy confidence of predators who knew their prey was cornered. "There's a back way out," Silas said, moving away from the window. "Through the root cellar. It leads to a wash that'll take you north toward the border. I'm not running anymore." He turned to face her fully for the first time since she'd entered his cabin. Clara Belle stood in the center of his small living space like she belonged there, her chin raised and her dark eyes blazing with a determination that reminded him of someone else, someone he'd failed to protect when it mattered most. "Those men will kill you. Maybe. But if I keep running, they'll eventually catch me anyway. And more people will die because of what I know." Outside, he heard the deputy's voice calling his name, the sound of it scraping against his nerves like fingernails on wood. They knew who he was, which meant they knew what he'd been before he disappeared into these mountains. "Silas Ward, we know you're in there. Send out the woman and we'll make this quick." Clara looked at him with those 2 knowing eyes. "So what's it going to be? Are you going to hide behind that door like you've been hiding for 10 years? Or are you going to remember who you used to be?" The deputy's words echoed off the canyon walls, but it was Clara's challenge that cut deeper than any threat. Silas stared at her, seeing past the bruised face and travel-worn dress to something that made his chest tighten with a pain he'd thought buried forever. She had the same fierce defiance that Sarah had possessed, the same refusal to back down even when death was breathing down her neck. "You don't know who I used to be," he said quietly, but even as the words left his mouth, he was moving toward the back room where his past lay hidden beneath loose floorboards. "I know enough." Clara followed him, her footsteps soft but determined. "I know you were a federal marshal. I know you lost someone important, and I know that's why you're afraid to fight back." Silas dropped to his knees and pried up the weathered boards with hands that remembered this motion from countless sleepless nights when the weight of memories became too much to bear. Beneath the floor, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of a life he'd sworn never to touch again. His badge, tarnished but still bearing the eagle that had once meant everything to him. His gun belt, the leather cracked, but the Colt still clean and ready. And beneath it all, a letter written in a woman's careful hand that he'd read so many times the paper had worn soft as fabric. Clara knelt beside him, and he caught the scent of sage and desperation that clung to her like a second skin. "She was everything to you, wasn't she? Her name was Sarah." The words came out like glass, cutting his throat on the way up. "She believed in justice the same way you do. Thought the law could protect innocent people. What happened to her?" Silas lifted the gun belt, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hands. The leather was like an old friend, shaped by years of wear to fit his body perfectly. Men wearing badges came for evidence she'd gathered, evidence that could have brought down half the territorial government. He buckled the belt around his waist, muscle memory guiding his movements. I wasn't there to protect her. Outside, the deputy was losing patience. Ward, you've got 30 seconds before we come in shooting. Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out a thick manila envelope, its edges worn from handling. This contains proof that Judge Morrison has been taking money to fix trials. Names, dates, amounts. 3 witnesses were murdered to keep this quiet, including my husband. Silas checked the cylinder of his Colt, each chamber loaded and ready. The weight of the weapon felt like putting on his own skin after 10 years of wearing a stranger's. Morrison was the judge who refused to investigate Sarah's murder. Then you know what kind of man we're dealing with. Through the window came the sound of boots hitting the ground as the riders dismounted. They were done talking, done waiting. In moments they would kick down his door and turn his sanctuary into a battleground. Clara stood and moved to the window, her shoulders squared against whatever was coming. I won't let them win, not after everything they've taken. Silas rose beside her, the familiar weight of his badge heavy in his other hand. For 10 years, he'd believed that justice was a luxury for people who'd never lost everything that mattered. But looking at Clara Belle, seeing the same fire that had burned in Sarah's eyes, he realized that justice wasn't something you received. It was something you fought for even when the fight seemed impossible. The cabin door exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. The deputy stepped through the shattered doorway with his gun drawn, his badge catching the light like a mockery of everything it was supposed to represent. Behind him, the 2 hired guns spread out, their weapons trained on the room with practiced efficiency. But they stopped short when they saw Silas standing there with his own Colt steady in his hand, the federal marshal's badge pinned to his chest where it belonged. Well, I'll be damned, the deputy said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and dark amusement. Silas Ward, thought you were dead. Not yet. Morrison's boy. Silas kept his gun trained on the deputy's chest, his finger light on the trigger, though I'm guessing that was the plan. The deputy's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood beside Silas with her chin raised in defiance. Just need the woman and whatever she's carrying. You can go back to playing hermit. Can't do that. Why not? She's nothing to you. Just some stranger who brought trouble to your door. But that wasn't true anymore, and Silas realized it with the clarity that comes in moments when everything hangs in the balance. Clara Belle wasn't just some stranger. She was every person he'd failed to protect, every life he might have saved if he'd been brave enough to keep fighting instead of running away to lick his wounds. She's under my protection, Silas said, and the words felt like coming home after a long journey. The deputy's face hardened. Your protection don't mean much these days, Ward. Not since you let your woman get herself killed. The words were designed to cut, to make him hesitate just long enough for them to gain the advantage. But instead of the crippling grief he'd carried for 10 years, Silas felt something else rising in his chest. Anger, clean and pure as mountain water. Sarah died because she believed the law would protect her, he said quietly, because she trusted men wearing badges like yours to do what was right. And look how that worked out for her. Clara stepped forward, her hand moving to the envelope in her satchel. It doesn't have to work out the same way for me. Little lady, you're holding evidence that could embarrass some very important people who don't like being embarrassed. Good, Clara said, pulling the envelope free and holding it up where all 3 men could see it. Because I intend to do more than embarrass them. The deputy's eyes fixed on the envelope like a snake watching a mouse. That's going to get you killed. Maybe, but it's also going to get them hanged. The standoff stretched between them. 4 people in a small cabin with enough firepower to level the building. Silas could feel the tension coiling tighter with each passing second, could see the calculation in the deputy's eyes as he weighed his options. Then Clara did something that changed everything. She struck a match and held it inches from the envelope. One wrong move, she said softly, and 10 years of evidence goes up in smoke. The match flame danced inches from the envelope, casting moving shadows across Clara's determined face. The deputy's gun wavered slightly, his confidence cracking like ice in spring thaw. Behind him, the 2 hired guns exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly realizing that their simple job had become something far more complicated. You're bluffing, the deputy said, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. You didn't walk 2 days through hostile country just to burn the evidence. Try me. Clara's voice was steady as bedrock. I've already lost everything that mattered. What's one more fire? Silas watched the interplay with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading dangerous situations. The deputy was off balance, caught between his orders and the very real possibility that his mission would end in failure. It was the kind of moment that could go either way, depending on who blinked first. Besides, Clara continued, moving the flame closer to the envelope's edge, this isn't the only copy. The lie was delivered with such perfect conviction that even Silas almost believed it. But he saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the tell that said she was risking everything on this one desperate gamble. You're lying, the deputy said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Am I? My husband was a careful man. Did you really think he'd keep all his evidence in one place? Clara smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. There are copies hidden where your boss will never find them. Copies that will see daylight if anything happens to me. The deputy's jaw worked silently, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and consequences. Silas used the moment to shift slightly, improving his angle of fire while keeping his weapon trained on the man's center mass. 10 years of isolation hadn't dulled his instincts, and every nerve in his body screamed that violence was about to explode in the confined space. Even if that's true, the deputy said finally, you still need to die. Both of you. Can't have loose ends walking around. There's another option, Silas said quietly, which is, you turn around, ride out of here, and pretend you never found us. The deputy laughed, but it was a harsh sound devoid of humor. And let Morrison hang for his crimes? Let the whole system come tumbling down because some woman couldn't keep her mouth shut? The system's already corrupted. We'd just be cleaning house. Easy words from a man who gave up his badge 10 years ago. Silas touched the metal star pinned to his chest, feeling its weight like a physical reminder of oaths taken and responsibilities shouldered. I never gave it up. I just forgot why I wore it. The match in Clara's hand burned lower, closer to her fingers. Soon she'd have to either drop it or let it burn her skin. The deputy saw it too, his gun steadying as he prepared to make his move. But Clara Belle had one more card to play. Tell me something, deputy. Do you have a family? The question caught him off guard. What's that got to do with anything? A wife? Children? That's none of your business. It is if you want them to stay safe. Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the tense silence. Because the man who hired you? Judge Morrison? He doesn't leave witnesses, and you've seen too much. The deputy's face went pale as the implication hit home. Silas saw the exact moment when doubt crept in, when the hired gun realized he might not be the hunter in this situation after all. That's when the shooting started. The first shot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. One of the hired guns, nerves frayed by Clara's psychological warfare, pulled his trigger a fraction of a second before thinking it through. The bullet went wide, splintering wood from the doorframe, but it was enough to unleash the storm that had been building in the small cabin. Silas moved with the fluid precision of a man whose body remembered 10 years of training, even when his mind had tried to forget. His Colt bucked in his hand, the familiar recoil traveling up his arm like an old song. The hired gun who'd fired first spun backward through the doorway, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. Clara dropped the match, but not before letting it fall onto the envelope. The papers caught fire immediately, flames licking hungrily at the edges as she dove behind Silas's kitchen table. The deputy lunged for the burning evidence, but Silas's second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him away from his goal. The remaining hired gun tried to use the chaos to his advantage, swinging his rifle toward Clara's hiding spot. But 10 years of isolation had taught Silas patience, and patience taught precision. His third shot found its mark, and the man crumpled to the floor beside his partner. Smoke filled the cabin as the envelope blazed, taking with it the evidence that 3 men had died trying to protect, and 3 others had died trying to destroy. Clara emerged from behind the table, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes blazing with fierce satisfaction. The deputy lay wounded but alive, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. You've killed us all, he gasped. Morrison will send more men. He'll never stop. Yes, he will, Clara said quietly, pulling a second envelope from a hidden pocket in her dress. Because this was never about the evidence. It was about making him show his hand. Silas stared at her, understanding flooding through him like cold water. You wanted them to come. I needed witnesses. Federal witnesses. Clara looked at him with something that might have been admiration. A respected marshal watching corrupt lawmen try to destroy evidence and commit murder. Your testimony will carry weight that mine never could." The deputy's face went ashen as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "You planned this. My husband taught me that sometimes the only way to catch a predator is to make yourself look like prey." Clara knelt beside the wounded man, her voice gentle but implacable. "Now you're going to tell Marshal Ward everything you know about Judge Morrison's operation. Every name, every bribe, every murdered witness." Silas holstered his Colt and looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 10 years. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, the floor stained with blood, the carefully constructed isolation shattered beyond repair. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something he'd thought lost forever: purpose. He pinned his badge more securely to his chest and helped Clara to her feet. Her hand was warm in his, real and alive and carrying the promise of justice finally served. "Marshal Ward," she said formally, but her eyes smiled. "I believe we have some arrests to make." Outside, their horses waited to carry them back toward a world that needed cleaning, and for the first time in 10 years, Silas Ward was ready to do the job he'd been born for. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny meet in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more